In the sweltering heat of a Virginia summer in 1862, a single letter landed on James Longstreet's desk like a gauntlet thrown down by a man who had decided he had nothing left to lose. The author was Ambrose Powell Hill, proud, fiery, and convinced that his professional honor had been dragged through the mud in black ink. Hill had just finished reading Longstreet's official report on the 7 days' battles. The bloodiest stretch of fighting the Army of Northern Virginia had yet endured. In those pages, where he had expected some acknowledgment of his Light Division's courage at Mechanicsville, Gaines's Mill, and Frayser's farm, Hill instead found what he took to be blame. What began as bruised feelings quickly exploded into demands for explanations, then a formal court of inquiry. The heated exchange between two of Robert E. Lee's most prominent division commanders threatened to tear at the command structure of an army still locked in the middle of a war. Lee himself had to step in before the fire consumed everything. Most history books treat this clash as little more than a colorful footnote, an ugly personal spat that Lee managed so the army could march on. But that is a mistake. This episode is far more than a side note. It gives us one of the clearest windows into what James Longstreet truly thought of Ambrose Powell Hill. Not the polite words spoken in public or the sanitized version later demanded by post-war Southern memory, but the raw professional judgment Longstreet committed to paper while Hill was still alive to read every word. Before we go deeper, if you're enjoying these stories that peel back the curtain on the real personalities and hidden tensions behind the Civil War battles, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps the channel grow and brings more of these forgotten chapters to life. To understand why this judgment mattered so much and why the friction between these two men ran so deep, we need to go back before the thunder of the 7 days. We need to meet both officers as they were, shaped by their upbringings, their early experiences under fire, and their fundamentally different ways of seeing war. Two proud, capable soldiers who were almost perfectly mismatched for sharing the same chain of command. James Longstreet was born in 1821 in South Carolina and raised in Georgia. He graduated from West Point in 1842, finishing 54th out of 62 in his class. That middling rank tells you something important about the man. He was not the type to wear himself out chasing academic glory or institutional approval. Longstreet fought in the Mexican-American War under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, earned 2 brevets for gallantry, and was wounded at Chapultepec in 1847. Those brutal campaigns gave him a practical, unromantic understanding of what real infantry combat looked like when the shooting started. Smoke, screams, bodies piling up in the mud. That experience shaped everything that followed. He believed in deliberate movement, strong defensive positions, and making the attacking enemy pay in blood for every yard gained. He did not trust the frontal assault. He did not believe that raw courage could substitute for good ground and careful preparation. Longstreet thought about war the way an engineer thinks about a bridge, in terms of load-bearing fundamentals rather than aesthetic ambition or glorious charges. He was, in the most useful sense, a military realist. Ambrose Powell Hill, born 4 years later in 1825 in Culpeper County, Virginia, was in almost every meaningful way his opposite. Hill graduated from West Point in 1847, served in both artillery and infantry, and carried the full weight of Virginia's proud military tradition, a lineage that had already produced Washington and would soon claim Lee and Jackson. That heritage placed aggressive action at the very center of what it meant to fight with honor. Hill brought to battle an electric energy that was either his greatest asset or his most dangerous quality, depending on the situation. He moved fast, struck hard, and took offense even faster. Both men shared a fierce professional pride, but they shared almost nothing else when it came to how war should actually be fought. Longstreet thought in terms of position, timing, and calculated risk. Hill thought in terms of momentum, pressure, and seizing the initiative the moment it appeared. Neither philosophy was wrong in itself, but when Hill's division answered to Longstreet's orders, the clash between those two ways of thinking was almost guaranteed. By the spring of 1862, both men held division commands in the Army Robert E. Lee had just taken over from the wounded Joseph Johnston. Lee inherited a force that had been defending Richmond with more caution than he found acceptable. He immediately began planning an offensive, the 7 days battles, that would require his division commanders to execute complicated, coordinated attacks across unfamiliar ground against a capable enemy. Success demanded officers who could read orders carefully and execute them as written. That last requirement would become the source of everything that followed between Longstreet and Hill. The campaign opened on June 25, 1862. By the very next day, it had already produced the first major evidence of how A.P. Hill operated under pressure. At Mechanicsville, Hill's Light Division was supposed to wait for Stonewall Jackson's flanking column to get into position before advancing. The entire plan depended on Jackson moving first and disrupting the Union line. But Jackson was late. Hours dragged by with no word from the north. Hill sat on the near side of Beaver Dam Creek with his men in formation, standing in the stifling heat while the afternoon light shifted. Then he did what A.P. Hill almost always did when forced to wait on circumstances beyond his control. He moved without the order. He sent his division forward alone against Union positions that had not been flanked and had not been weakened, because Jackson had never moved. The Union line was intact, well-manned, and supported by artillery covering every approach. The result was as predictable as it was costly. Hill's men broke against those prepared defenses again and again. His division suffered roughly 1,400 casualties in frontal assaults that the original plan had been specifically designed to make unnecessary. It was, by almost any professional standard, an expensive and avoidable failure, the product of a commander who could not hold himself in position once his patience ran out, no matter what the orders required. Longstreet noted it. The kind of officer he was, the realist forged in Mexico, did not forget what it looked like when a carefully designed battle plan was discarded because one commander decided his own impatience was reason enough to move. The following days brought mixed results. At Gaines's Mill on June 27th, Hill's division performed better and helped break the Union line, sending McClellan retreating toward the James River. But at Frayser's farm on June 30th, the fighting was confused from the first shots until darkness fell. It was here that Longstreet's assessment of Hill hardened into something permanent. The exact details remain murky because both men had reasons to present events in ways that favored their own conduct. What is clear is that Longstreet believed Hill's division had failed to perform as ordered during a critical phase, and that this failure had cost the Confederates a chance to inflict greater damage on the retreating Union columns. He said so in his official report, measured language, but impossible to misread. An official report was not a private letter. It was a permanent document that would be read by Lee, the War Department, and anyone with access to the records. In the honor-bound culture of the 1862 Confederate Officer Corps, especially among men drawn from the Southern gentry, embedding criticism in an official report was a serious public judgment. Hill read it and understood exactly what Longstreet had done. He wrote, demanding clarification. Longstreet's response was not a retraction. He believed what he had written. The exchange of letters escalated quickly. Hill demanded a formal court of inquiry, his right under military law. Longstreet, by some accounts, moved toward placing Hill under arrest for the tone of his correspondence. The sequence of who threatened what is murky, but the direction was unmistakable. Two senior generals were turning a professional dispute into something that looked dangerously personal. Lee intervened. He did not resolve the underlying clash. There was no easy fix that would satisfy both men, but he managed the consequences with the skill that defined his handling of difficult subordinates. Charges were set aside, the correspondence was taken off the active table, and the matter was officially closed. What did not close was Longstreet's view of Hill. After the Second Manassas and Maryland campaigns, Lee reorganized the Army of Northern Virginia into two corps. Hill's Light Division went to Stonewall Jackson's command. On paper, it was a simple redistribution of forces. In practice, it removed Hill from Longstreet's direct authority and placed their command relationship beyond the point where personal friction could continue to destabilize operations. It solved the structural problem. It did not change what Longstreet thought. What happened next is one of the more revealing coincidences in Hill's career. He immediately began having the same kind of dispute with Jackson that he had been having with Longstreet. Within months of joining Jackson's corps, Hill was arrested twice, once during the march north to Second Manassas, and again during the Maryland campaign, both times for alleged violations of march orders. The charges were serious enough that Hill composed a formal response and, according to officers on both staffs, came close to challenging Jackson to a duel. Those charges were still unresolved when Jackson was wounded at Chancellorsville in May 1863 and died a week later. The matter died with him. Pursuing grievances against the Confederacy's newest martyr was unthinkable. The officer corps closed ranks around Jackson's memory, the way armies always close ranks around their heroic dead. But the pattern is worth noticing. In roughly a year of active campaigning, A.P. Hill had reached the point of formal confrontation with two of the three most senior generals in the Army of Northern Virginia: Longstreet over an official report, Jackson over march discipline and command authority. What this pattern reveals is not simply that Hill was difficult, though he certainly could be. It shows a man with a specific sensitivity to any suggestion that his professional conduct had been found wanting. He interpreted criticism from superiors as an attack on his personal honor rather than the normal exercise of command authority, and he responded with the full intensity of someone for whom reputation and identity were inseparable. Longstreet understood this about Hill. He had seen it up close, and it shaped the way he wrote about him for the rest of his life. Hill's battlefield record across the war genuinely complicates any simple judgment. He earned his reputation in the 7 days at Cedar Mountain, Second Manassas, and most dramatically at Sharpsburg on September 17, 1862. There, his Light Division arrived after a grueling 17-mile forced march from Harper's Ferry in just 8 hours and smashed into the Union left at the exact moment the Confederate line was on the edge of collapse. It was one of the decisive tactical interventions of the entire war, a division that had marched itself nearly into the ground, arriving in time to save the Army. Men who witnessed it called it the finest fighting march the Army of Northern Virginia ever made. Longstreet acknowledged Sharpsburg in his memoir. He could not have done otherwise. The record was too clear and the witnesses too numerous. But his acknowledgment carried a different quality than his writing about officers he considered truly great. When Longstreet wrote about John Bell Hood or Lafayette McLaws, there was warmth in the prose, a sense of personal investment in their reputations. That quality is simply not present when he writes about Hill. Longstreet's memoir, From Manassas to Appomattox, published in 1896, is itself a document that requires careful reading. He was 75 years old and writing as a man who had spent 3 decades being accused in the Southern press and in the flood of lost cause literature of having lost Gettysburg through his tardiness on July 2, 1863. He wrote defensively with scores to settle, yet the defensive posture does not fully explain his treatment of Hill, because Hill was not part of the Gettysburg argument. By then, Hill commanded the 3rd Corps, separate from Longstreet's 1st Corps. Longstreet had no strategic reason to undercut him. What he did instead was something more telling. He applied a level of critical scrutiny to Hill's performance that he did not apply equally to officers he genuinely admired. At Bristoe Station in October 1863, Hill's corps attacked a Union position without fully reconnoitering it and suffered heavy casualties against an enemy better prepared than Hill had understood. Lee's quiet rebuke, "Bury these poor men and let us say no more about it," became one of the famous moments of quiet command disappointment. Longstreet noted Hill's conduct at Bristoe Station in the Memoir, and the way he noted it tells you something important about how he processed Hill's entire record, not with contempt or personal attack, but with a clinical precision that was in its own way more damning than anger. Assembled from the available evidence, Longstreet's view of Hill seems to have been this: Hill was a fighter of genuine courage whose aggressiveness was real and whose instincts for offensive action were sometimes brilliant and sometimes catastrophic, with no reliable internal mechanism for distinguishing between the two in advance. He was a man whose personal pride was so tightly wound into his professional identity that he could not receive criticism without interpreting it as an attack on his honor. This made him difficult to manage within a chain of command that required subordinates to accept correction as a normal part of the work. In Longstreet's estimation, Hill performed best when given a clear objective and the latitude to pursue it without the burden of coordinating with others, and worst when the situation required patience, precise execution of orders he had not written, or the kind of command discipline that involves restraining one's own impulses in service of a larger plan. That assessment was not invented by Longstreet. Lee shared versions of it, expressed in the private language of a commander who had to work with the officers he had rather than the ones he might have preferred. Jackson shared it in the blunt form his arrests of Hill demonstrated. Hill was killed on April 2, 1865, during the final collapse of the Petersburg lines, shot by Union soldiers near his headquarters in the confusion as the Confederate front disintegrated. It was one of the more solitary deaths of a senior officer in the war, a man riding forward with only a small escort to try to understand what was happening to his corps. He died before the surrender at Appomattox 8 days later, before the long post-war accounting with what the war had meant and who bore responsibility for its outcome. He never wrote a memoir. He never participated in the lost cause arguments that consumed surviving Confederate leaders for decades. He never placed his own account of the 7 days dispute or the confrontation with Longstreet on the permanent record. The officers closest to him, men who had served on his staff and commanded his brigades, carried the memory of his version of those events. But memory carried by staff officers is not the same as a memoir written by the principal. And in the post-war contest over Confederate reputation, the men who wrote books shaped the historical record in ways the men who did not could not match. That asymmetry mattered. Longstreet lived until 1904. He had 40 years after the war to shape how posterity understood the conflicts within the Army of Northern Virginia's command. He used those years aggressively, defending his own record against critics who blamed him for Gettysburg, challenging the mythology built around Jackson and Stuart and others. He had motive, ability, and longevity. Hill had none of those advantages in the post-war battle over reputation. What survives is therefore Longstreet's account, written by a man who understood exactly what he was doing with every word he committed to paper. In that account, A.P. Hill appears as a soldier of considerable fighting quality, whose record was permanently marked by the same qualities that made him dangerous and effective on a battlefield: the impulsiveness, the sensitivity to command authority, the difficulty operating within the constraints a corps-level army required of its division commanders. Longstreet saw what he saw, wrote what he believed, and let the record speak. The clash between these two men was never just about one report or one campaign. It was about two fundamentally different ways of seeing war and the very real human cost when those visions collided inside the same army at the height of its most desperate fighting. If you want more deep dives into the personal dramas, command tensions, and hidden stories that shaped the Civil War, drop a comment with the next commander or battle you'd like explored. Like and subscribe so you never miss an episode, and I'll see you in the next one.